The following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
Well, welcome to the Chic Chattin. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm Karen Testerman, your host, and this is State Representative Mark Pearson, who represents Hampstead. He's additionally the assistant floor leader, correct, for the party?
I also represent Atkinson, Plastow, and Kingston.
Wow. So, in New Hampshire, that's about 3,000 people, correct?
Well,
3,300?
Statistically, if you divide the number of state reps into the population, it comes out to about 3,300. But I have what's called a floterial district, which is an at-large district. So I represent actually about 28,000 people.
I see. Okay. But you don't get paid anymore.
I do. We like to say we get $100 a year. That's not entirely true because the feds get a cut. So it's $83 a year.
But you have to also buy your state license plate?
We do.
Yes.
And we have to buy business attire if we don't already have it. It is a labor of love. It's a volunteer group, basically.
Well, that was the way our founding fathers really anticipated that our government would run. And so I applaud you and thank you for joining us. So now, Mark, one of the things that you do as a state legislator is to introduce legislation. How do you come about deciding what legislation you'd like to introduce?
Some of it just comes from our interests. One of the things I do when I'm not in Concord is I'm chief executive officer of a faith-based nonprofit medical and counseling center in Kingston. Mm-hmm. So, of course, I'm quite interested in things having to do with healthcare, things like that.
Okay.
Other legislators do the same with their interests, perhaps what their career was. A lot of former teachers are in the education committee of the House. Sometimes a constituent would call and say, why don't we do something about such and such? And when they call me, I might say, that sounds fantastic. I want to read up on that. I'll go to work on that. Mm-hmm. Or I might say, I know just the person you could call who's interested in that sort of thing.
Okay. And when you submit an idea, is it already written and all figured out when you put it into the legislature, or is there a process that you have to follow?
There is a process, and the better bills are the ones where we've done a lot of legwork, we've researched, we've talked to stakeholders, we've talked to professionals. We have researchers in the State House who can find out what other states are doing about that. And then we come in as good a form as we can make it to some folks in the legislature who help craft the bill for us, make sure there's nothing illegal in it, make sure that it's worded correctly, and so on. They don't change the policy, but they make sure that it's ready.
Okay. And then it gets assigned to a committee and...
Well, you want to get some co-sponsors.
Okay.
And when I got to the House, I was told 80% of what we do is not partisan. It's just good common sense things that need to be done.
Okay.
I think that's true, although there are people on the extremes of both parties that try to make everything partisan, and I don't think they should. So we will
By
go
partisan, you mean they've got an agenda that they want to go
for?
Oh,
yes, a far left agenda, a far right agenda. Some people have agendas that I still can't figure out. And then we go looking for co-sponsors. Uh-huh. And as much as possible, I like to have senators as well as representatives. I like to have Democrats and Republicans as much as possible.
Right. And is there a limit to the number of co-sponsors you can get?
You can have up to 9 other representatives, and I believe it's 3 senators.
Okay. And do you find that difficult to do when you're selling your, coming up and saying, hey, look, this is something that I would like to sponsor? Do you have a hard time getting people to say, I don't know, or a yes, or maybe?
The longer you've been there, the easier it is, because you get to know people.
Okay.
There's sometimes I'll put a bill in, and one of the sponsors is so different from me on so many things, but we agree on this.
Okay.
And it doesn't mean we're allies, it just means on this particular issue. And sometimes, if I go to a potential co-sponsor, they'll say, well, I like the bill, but, and then I look at the objections. And sometimes I find the objections make my bill stronger, and that person has helped the bill and now co-sponsors it. Sometimes I find the objections, I understand the objections, I don't agree with the objections, to put them into the bill would weaken it. So I say, well, thanks, maybe next time.
Right. Okay.
So
Very good.
the more work you do, it's like building a building. The most important part of the building is the foundation that no one sees.
Right.
But if you don't work on that, your building's going to fall over.
Exactly.
And I've seen good bills die because the homework wasn't done.
Exactly. Or the language isn't quite right.
Right.
Yeah. I know there are people who read the bills and pick up on little things like an "and" or a "the." You wouldn't think that would change the meaning of a bill, but it does, and it's it's helpful if you can find somebody like that to help you along
It's
the
like
line.
a contract that I let for one of the new employees, and after describing the duties of the position, I added, and other duties as from time to time may be assigned, which basically means you're going to do whatever I want you to do.
Exactly.
And she immediately picked up on that.
Okay.
And said, would you ever ask me to do such and such? And I said, no. She says, good then. But she picked up on that.
Good.
And so with bills that I'm submitting, I run them by savvy people to see, okay, where am I putting a loophole in I don't intend to?
Okay.
Where am I squeezing out somebody I don't mean to?
Right. Right. So very good. So now one of the bills that you've introduced this particular session has to do with women's sports.
Right.
Talk about that. What spurred you to introduce this particular legislation, and what do you hope to accomplish?
I remember 50 years ago when in most schools and colleges there were a lot of men's sports and not so much for women. And along comes Title IX, an education bill signed into law that said you couldn't do that, that you had to equalize as best as you could the number of women's teams with the number of men's teams. And this really gave a break, an appropriate break to women's athletics. And now with the transgender movement, that is very much in danger. And we're in danger of seeing that progress that's been made over the last decades start to slip away. We've had occasions around the country, and I've studied these, I've chased them down. I'm not a person to listen to somebody told. I want to find it out. Where a woman who had been number one on her team and was setting state records and was going to get scholarships to college. Suddenly, a person born male, but now believing the self to be female, joined the team, joined the women's team. And now this woman is no longer number one, no longer has the record, and is not going to get her scholarship. And that's not fair.
Right. Because the male is built differently, can achieve, muscle-wise, they're stronger, and they can achieve the level that the female cannot in the same situation.
Yeah, this bill is about justice for women. It's not an attempt to attack anyone else. It is about justice. This past Monday night, I was a speaker at a Martin Luther King celebration service in Atkinson. And they played audio clips of Dr. King. And one of the clips has Dr. King say, justice for the black man is not at the expense of justice for the white man. And so when people say to me, I want my child who believes herself to be female. I want justice for her, and why are you trying to kick her out of sports? My answer, first of all, is we're not kicking anyone out of sports. This child of yours who was born male can be on the male team where the body shape and all the, the DNA and everything else is the appropriate place. That's one.
Right.
Secondly, you are ignoring the injustice. You, in the quest for your own issue, your own rights, you're denying the rights now of some other people. When Title IX came out, it wasn't perfect.
Right.
And people could already see there's going to be a problem here and a problem there. So they said, we've got to get something into law, and then we'll work on it. So, for example, there were some schools that said, all right, you want the number of male teams and female teams to be equal? Here's what we're going to do. We're cutting out high school football.
Right.
Why did they do that? To get people at each other's throats, instead of saying, how can we as a school honor the various needs? Now, what I would say is, why not have some co-ed teams? Why not have a co-ed tennis team? You can have a male team, a female team. Why not a co-ed team? Why not a co-ed field hockey team? There are many sports that can be done in a co-ed way, but don't join the women's team and get them effectively kicked off the podium.
Well, what about, you have this situation too where there was a young man, I believe, who was wrestling, and it was a female that was going to be wrestling with him. And he said, no, I can't do that. Morally, I cannot do that. And so here was a young man who was going to be the star, could have been all the way up to the top and so forth, but he self-regulated himself because he thought it was improper in this particular sport.
See, what I would say is this is what liberalism is. Liberalism is not my demanding and my taking away from you. It wasn't 50 years ago. It wasn't when Dr. King said it. It wasn't today. So when people say, well, you're fighting against this liberal move, this is not a liberal move. This is a very selfish, me first, me only at your expense move. And there are other things that can be done.
Right.
For example, they also said about Title IX sports, well, it cost a lot of money to rig up the players in a football squad.
Right.
Are you saying we have to spend an equal amount of money on women's sports? And they tweaked it in the House, and a couple of Democrat senators came forward with an amendment to say, no, we're talking about equal access. And equal access may mean now we add a girls' lacrosse team. And it doesn't cost as much money as a boys' football team, but now there's more sports.
Okay.
So it's common sense equality, not counting little beans and getting into fights.
Right. So how do you get human nature to behave themselves in this particular case? Right.
Yeah.
It's always a challenge. Now, what other...
Well, let me finish, if I may.
Sure.
I've experienced several Democratic legislators come up to me privately and say, I believe you, you're right, I've got to summon up coverage because the pressure from people calling and screaming at me on the phone is intense. Interestingly, by the way, we had a coach, a women's sports coach, come to the hearing when my bill was introduced.
Right.
And she described her politics as being far left. And she says, but therefore, I am all in favor of still having justice for women's sports. So this isn't a conservative versus liberal.
No.
This is justice issue. And of course, those who say, well, my child doesn't wish to participate in that, and I hear what you're saying about this, we can work on issues as they did 50 years ago.
Right. Understood. And the other thing about that is that we have to, at some point, some of this has become so radical, and my personal concern is that we have kids that we're spending so much time on this bathrooms and locker rooms type situation.
Well, just to show you how silly it gets, over the years, it's evolved in our colleges that students want safe places, places where they can go and not be challenged, not have to confront arguments that give flashbacks to unpleasant memories in childhood, maybe even take a book off the reading list. I'm not 100% on board with that, but it is something that is being taught. Now, all of a sudden, the same group that fought for that is saying that biological males, maybe even before surgery, can go into women's bathrooms. What happened to safe spaces? What happened to trigger mechanisms when 1 out of 3 women have in some way, to some degree, had a sexual assault? Now, all of a sudden, in a bathroom, the girls' room, which should be a safe place, now all of a sudden it can't be? What are these people thinking? Do they not care about the hurts of women?
Right. Well, and not just women. I mean, even little boys. That where you have someone. It seems like it's opening the door to pedophilia, and to a large extent, where people can now go wherever they want to go. And as you say, where is the safe space? Where is that place where I feel protected? And we had a woman who testified in one of the not on the bill, but testified on a situation where she was talking about when she was in high school, and just going to the ladies' part of it, going to the girls' locker room, the uncomfortableness she felt undressing in front of other girls. There's a certain modesty that we seem to have thrown out the door and lost to a certain extent. And so I think we need to ratchet it back a little bit and talk about the majority of the people and the fact that we are establishing policies that affect all children and not just 1 or 2, to make 1 or 2 comfortable in the process.
If it's fair for one group, it has to be fair straight across the board. And calmer people can work together and come up with ways that help us all.
Right. Which you have done with your one of your other bills that you've gotten passed and through legislation to help those people who are stopped on the side of the road and they happen to be deaf.
I was asked to become the chairman of the New Hampshire Commission on Deafness and Hearing Loss a year ago. And I used that occasion to see what needed to be done, what could be done. Now, my political motto is do the most good for the most people in the most cost-effective way. The New Hampshire union leader referred to me once as a bleeding heart conservative. So I picked up the phone and I called Joe McQuaid, who was the publisher then, and said, Joe, I don't know whether you meant that as a compliment or as an insult, but I'm going to take it as a compliment because there's a lot of good work that can be done. Now, stereotypes for a minute. There's one group politically that I really think care a lot about people, but their immediate go-to next move is, well, we're going to have to hire 20 more people, and in order to pay for it, we're going to have to go up on these fees or taxes or whatever. There's another group that in reaction to that said, we're not going to let our taxes go and fees go up, so never mind this program.
Right.
And I'm sort of saying, folks, there is a third choice here. Not everything can be done for low budget.
Right.
My road was paved last summer. I didn't chip in $50 to do it. It came out of taxes. I know that. But there's a lot of things that can be done in a very low budget way that help a lot of people. And with my commission, we're exploring what are the needs? What are the possibilities? We came up with this card. And it is for deaf people. And a deaf person or a hard of hearing person is pulled over by a police officer, and the police officer's trying to communicate. And most police officers will recognize, okay, this person isn't hearing me well, how can we work on that? But there's the occasional police officer, probably has had a bad day, probably exhausted, never knows what's going to happen because there's bad people out there.
Or this is an initial exposure.
And this card says, I'm not playing a game with you, I'm not on drugs. And so this card can be handed to the police officer. The deaf person or hard of hearing person can point to things. The police officer can point to things. Communication has been established. And along the bottom of the card, you will see the logos of all the major law enforcement groups in the state of New Hampshire. They're on board with this. Now, we are slowly rolling this out. And copies of this will be eventually at all the police stations, all the town halls. I gave a batch of these to my audiologist, and she's going to bring a batch of these at their next audiologists meeting. And every audiologist in the state's going to have one eventually.
So now these are printed and ready to go?
Pretty much out there, but even more so, yes.
Okay.
Ready to go.
So we now know that if we need one of these, we can go to the police station and get one?
Police station, perhaps City Hall, and I got an email today from one of the towns in my district saying, you had great publicity, but we never got the cards. Probably because a town official couldn't make the meeting where they were being handed out. So I'm going to be stopping off and giving them a batch. We are again going to get them to the otorhinolaryngologists, the ear doctors.
Right.
So they'll have a batch of them. We're getting them into hospitals. The other night at this Dr. King service, I handed them out to every pastor who was there and say, announce it in your church.
Right.
So we're going to try to get this so widely available that anybody who needs it can have one.
Okay, good. So it's nice. There's quick communication tips that say, you know, if you're shining a flashlight in my face, it may make it harder for me to understand you because I'm reading your lips, basically, right? Get my attention first. In other words, wave at me or something. Make eye contact with me when you speak so that I can see your lips moving. I may need to communicate through a qualified sign language interpreter.
And here are the phone numbers where you can call if necessary. If
it's
more than a brief stop, you know, the officer may say, I'm just giving you, where is it? I'm just giving you, here it is, a warning. I'm not ticketing you. There's no big problem here, but have a nice day. Just don't do this again.
Right.
But if there is a problem, here are the phone numbers where during the daytime or after hours, a person can call and a sign language interpreter could be made available.
Excellent.
And this is a great thing. The police, I have a state police captain who's detailed to work with my commission, and he's just excited, and his fellow officers are, at how this is going to be a good thing.
It is a good thing. So have you had another piece of legislation that you've had some success with?
Well, we're working on a number of issues to benefit the deaf and hard of hearing community. We're trying to get a census so we'll know how many folks fall into this and where are they. Now, we're very careful not to identify people by name. So we want to know in Coos County how many, in metropolitan Nashua how many, so we can deploy the resources as needed. And unfortunately in New Hampshire there's this attitude, I don't want anybody to know my business, and it cuts across the political spectrum. And we're trying to say, folks, we're doing this to help people in need and they want this. Let them worry about being found out. Don't do it for them. They want this. So we're working on that. A sizable amount of money, Department of Education Commissioner Frank Edelblue was able to obtain a sizable amount of money to find out where the gaps are in education of deaf students in the state. There's a lot of good people in the school system, teachers working on individualized education programs and so on, but there are gaps. One person wants to do the right thing, doesn't know how quite to get the tools. Other people don't even, well, they don't know what they don't know. And we've got 3 consultants in. I was on a conference call with them this morning. They're going to come before my commission next month. We're going to use this as an opportunity to say, here are the concerns we have. Here are some of the gaps in the system. We're not talking about a lot of money. We're just talking about getting good use of the money we have so that kids in school can learn.
Right. I don't, you know, one of the things I thought about as we were talking about is that not many people know that if you become proficient in American Sign Language or any sign language, actually, that it actually counts as a foreign language credit at a college or a high school and wherever you have a
We presently in the state have a significant shortage of audiologists. Part of the reason is in order to go get your degree, you come out with a sizable debt. And so you've got to get into a situation that can really help. So the audiologists tend to cluster into certain places where they can be paid well.
Right.
They've got to pay off their bills.
Right.
So the thought is, and this is something I did with a nurse practitioner in the medical practice that I oversee, let's pay part of your tuition on the condition you go practice in Plymouth
right.
or Littleton or another underserved area for a period of years. Now we've got the resources there for the people, and this person is able to do it. This is helping the citizens out. So there's numbers of things we're identifying where, with a frugal use of resources,
Right.
we can help people.
Good. Now, if somebody wants to get in touch with Representative Mark Pearson, how do they do that?
Well, I think there's something that's on the screen, my email address.
Okay.
And just to let people know, you have to put your name and where you're from. I read the bottom of an email first. If you don't identify yourself, I hit delete. Your email won't be read. Secondly, I don't read rants. Threats will be turned over to law enforcement. But if you've got a great idea, if you disagree with me on something, if you want to dialogue with me, if you want to make a suggestion of how we can improve services to the deaf and hard of hearing, please email me. Now, some days I get 500 emails. So if you don't hear back from me right away, I'm not blowing you off. I'm getting through my email.
Well, and that you make a very, very good point, is because email can come from anywhere. So if you really want your legislator to pay attention to your email, you really need to identify, as you say, your name and where you're from. And that helps them. And even if you put it in the subject line, that helps you, the legislator, go through that. And I do know you get 500 or so a day.
But we're trying very hard to improve services to the deaf and hard of hearing in the state. We got good people, trained people. We have more to do.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Mark Pearson, Representative Mark Pearson, Flotillery in Hampstead, for joining me on the Chic Chattin.
The preceding program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.